Hey, this is Alex from RF Venue. In this video, we're teaming up with freelancer Richard Stockton and FOH Productions on his use of Vantage alongside Wireless Workbench on a fairly large corporate gig with over 50 channels of wireless microphones and intercoms spread across a huge facility, some on a main presentation stage and others in breakout rooms in other parts of the convention hall. Richard starts with what he calls homework. This is days in advance of the event itself. Here we see him do what's normally done when using Wireless Workbench alone. He's already got his inventory loaded into the program, detailing all of the devices and frequencies occupying those channels. The first thing he does is to take a spectrum scan from one of the network UHFR receivers in the H4 band with Wireless Workbench. And you can see in time-lapse Workbench now collecting the scan from the receiver through the network, which is an amazing feature, but he can't see the entire UHF broadcast band outside of range H4. So he actually adds in another scan here from the J5 range to get a more complete picture. Then he calculates the ideal frequencies that each of those devices should be tuned to, so they don't encounter any intermodulation between one another. And finally, for the receivers that are on the network, he deploys the calculated frequencies to those devices. Then he hops over to monitoring and checks the levels. He does a little troubleshooting on a mystery with antenna B, fixes it, and there we go. If you were using Workbench and nothing else, your homework would end here. But for almost every professional coordinator, using Workbench or IAS or some other frequency coordination program alone isn't enough to make absolutely sure that your frequencies are reliable. And not to mention, although Workbench is an incredibly powerful program, if you're using your receivers to take your scans, you're limited in what you can see by the bandwidth of your receivers. In this case, range H4 and J5. So Richard hops from Workbench over to Vantage to get a wider scan that he can then import back into Workbench to look for trouble that the receivers can't see, and to use those data to fine-tune his frequencies even more. He goes to the export feature, selects his range, selects how he wants his data export processed, and then begins the scan. He saves the scan to his hard drive, then hops back over to Workbench and imports that file by clicking on the folder icon next to the words Scan Files. And there it is, the scan from Vantage. He reanalyzes with the spectrum data collected externally through Vantage and sees if he needs to make any changes. Of course, Workbench also allows you to layer scan files on top of one another. So the next thing Richard does is take a second scan from Vantage, this time from 400 to 700 megahertz, exports that, pulls up Workbench, which already has a scan that came from an H4 range receiver, and then layers the broader band scan he just made in Vantage on top of the receiver's scan. And now he's got much more to work with in Workbench than he would have been able to achieve using Workbench alone. Because Workbench can network and communicate with its receivers, the monitoring function there is really powerful. But because of what we talked about earlier, because what the levels are reflecting are essentially the first-person view of the spectrum from the point of view of the receivers, there are some things that the level meters and monitoring function can miss. Richard, without any coaching from us, figured out how to use Vantage's monitoring function to double-check each of his networked UHFR frequencies. By loading those frequencies into Vantage and then selecting only a single frequency at a time, he can zoom in to within 500 kilohertz above and below each channel's frequency to make sure that there isn't anything in the spectrum that might interfere with his deployment. And sure enough, by using Vantage as an external spectrum analyzer, he located two possibly troublesome and mysterious radio waves very close to one of his transmitters. Here you can see Richard turning that transmitter on and off and hovering the markers over the two things of concern. We don't know exactly what these things are. They could be an intermod, they could be another mic signal coming from somewhere in the facility, whatever. But after investigation and some work that took place outside of both software programs, like checking the audio on the mic itself, Richard came to the conclusion that these two spurious signals were not a threat to the production, and he moved on.